So I wanted to start off the talk with a little thought experiment called a divergence thinking test. It's sort of like an IQ test, but instead of logic and reasoning, you're going to have to use your creativity and your imagination. So the task is to come up with as many alternative uses as you can for an everyday object, like an apple. So, and for people doing this at home, see how many you can come up with in about 5 minutes. Now, it's interesting that the average person can only come up with around 10 or 15, which is surprisingly low. But the people that are good at this can come up with around 100 to 200. Now, this tests one's ability to think divergently, which in essence is a person's capacity to approach a different problem many different ways, and to think, quote-unquote, outside of the box. There was a study conducted in a book called Breakpoint and Beyond, co-authored by George Land and Beth Jarman, that students, kindergartners, took place in a part of a study where they started to take a test on divergent thinking. And 98% of these kids were considered geniuses. And when the same test was re-administered 5 years later, only a third of those kids were considered geniuses. And then 5 years after that, only 14%. So my question is, why are kids losing their essential capacities to think creatively as they go through school? Whether you're a CEO of a big company, or an electrician, or perhaps a writer, you need divergent thinking to be able to solve problems in creative ways. Yet, school still seems to discourage, and in fact suppress, creativity and divergent thinking rather than foster. So, in the context of a 21st century education model, we should look at the ways to implement divergent thinking so that we can prepare better kids for the future. So, today I've come up with 3 ideas, all of which encompass divergent thinking, characterized by curiosity, critical thinking, and creativity, as essential skills to developing kids to live in a world driven by information and innovation. My first idea looks at the role of the traditional classroom experience. From calculus videos on Khan Academy to John Green's amazing crash course videos on YouTube, the vast majority of knowledge that we're being taught in classes like US history and biology are already available online. So, my proposition, and as many educators like Salman Khan have already demonstrated the potential of this, is that we flip the classroom experience so that kids effectually learn the content at home for homework and use class time to develop skills that they would otherwise miss out on the opportunity. Now, Changing Educational Paradigms by Sir Ken Robinson talks a little bit about this video, about this idea. Teachers would effectively be able to spend their class time working on individuals' weaknesses and stimulating their curiosities through more engaging activities. Now, I think the most critical attribute of a flipped classroom experience is the way that it strays away from the antiquated assumption that drilling information is the primary focus of an educational experience. With this, students are effectively allowed to spend time collaborating and learning a subject more organically. And it takes the role of the teacher from more of a lecturer to a mentor, which is what I think is at the heart of a divergent thinking model. So my second idea, one that I'm particularly passionate about, is the idea of a year-long independent project. And before I get into the logistics of the idea, I'll give you a little preface with a story. 2 years ago, I watched a TED Talk by a little 6th grader named Tommy Suarez, who spoke about developing his own iPhone. And at the time, I was in 9th grade, and I didn't really know much about programming and app development, but I immediately became fascinated with the idea of developing my own app. So I started to draw out my own little designs, think of little ideas, and started to create an idea that I would want to develop. And then I immediately learned something special. All of the teachers at school were perfect mentors in that they all had their own unique expertise to help me with. For example, if I needed help on graphic design, it needed some legal advice or content development advice, or perhaps physically programming, there was a teacher with the expertise to help me. Now this was really special. And flash forward 3 to 4 months later, I started to see how my own creativity and my own passion motivated me to see the project through. For example, I dedicated my whole summer, just out of pure passion, to create the iPhone application and get an internship and write the code. And exactly a year after the final talk, the final time I saw the TED Talk, I was able to finally create the idea. And after all the intense work, I started to realize something special and appreciate Thomas Friedman's quote in regards to educational achievement. Curiosity combined with the motivation to learn is much more important than pure intelligence. Whether I was creating my own storyboards for the design or physically writing code, I couldn't fathom how much fun I had at the same time as much as I was learning. So I think this is best captured in the idea of an independent year-long project, which is something that's very possible to implement in schools. So the course could sort of function like a year-long course where students develop their own projects. For example, if a kid was interested in creative writing, he could spend the time of the course developing his own book or perhaps his own TV sitcom. And in order to keep it official, there could be a thorough metric evaluation. So kids would be assessed on their final product as well as their development over the course of the year. And then this kind of grassroots divergent thinking education model really fosters curiosity and passion from the ground up. Tony Wagner, a mentor and an educator, described the academic progression of a student in 3 core ways. He argued that play, passion, and purpose is the 3-step approach that stimulates kids to becoming citizens in society. And he argued that most people that go through the education system aren't able to tap into their interests and their talents. However, I think that an independent long project will allow kids to foster their own curiosity and develop their own passions that will have lifelong implications. My third and final idea looks at testing and assessments under a divergent thinking lens. So most of the assessments in classes like US history and biology, maths, and sciences focus on content consolidation. And by that I mean one's ability to memorize facts and regurgitate them onto a test. For example, here's a traditional type of question you might be asked in a US history class. Analyze the response of Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration to the problems of the Great Depression and use your knowledge of the time to develop your answer. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with this type of question, but nonetheless, a large portion of the student's academic ability is dependent on his ability to recall facts and regurgitate the information. And obviously there is a little bit of analysis required, but for the most part it's pretty superficial. A grader, for example, would look for some main historical points that the teacher is the question is asking for, and just if the student writes it on the essay, just assumes that the information is good. But I want to look at ways you can employ creativity and divergent thinking into the same question. And frankly, I think a new framework would make it more interesting to read as well as interesting to write. So the new question would read, if you were put in the position of FDR's administration during the problems of the Great Depression, how would you respond? And now you would be assessing the exact same things that the administration has done, except through your own lens. So this kind of question would effectually test your ability to think and employ your creativity and problem-solving abilities. It also requires you to use the same knowledge that you've developed and learned, but use it in a creative fashion. And much like problems in the real world, solutions to problems and decision-making is largely dependent on a lot of creativity, a lot of evaluation. And that's why I think a divergent education model fosters that important attribute that students should incorporate. So, in conclusion, I proposed 3 ideas: flipping the classroom experience, independently driven projects, and employing divergent thinking into tests and assessments. And I think these three basically characterize divergent thinking and education for the 21st century. They allow students to develop their own passions and their own interests, as well as add a little flair into the current education model. And that's very important. Thank you.